Andre Chagwedera is the co-founder and CEO of Fleming Protocol, which is a data economy DAO that empowers patients to collaborate with scientists and industry to create impactful biomedical innovation. So Fleming Protocol seeks to allow patients to hold full custody over their own health data, and then even capture value on that data that otherwise would have been monetized by other larger corporations that would have owned your health data. And so it's definitely a very noble mission. And it sounds like there's a lot of regulatory hoops to jump through. And so with that, Andre, I also want to say Andre has been kind of a pleasure to communicate with, has been very responsive and kind of very enthusiastic about DeSci in general. And so with that, please, Andre, take it away and tell us about how patients and citizen scientists can help drive biomedical innovation forward.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jeff. I appreciate the very kind introduction. Yeah, hi, everybody. So as you know, I'm one of the co-founders of Fleming Protocol, which is a data economy DAO where patients, scientists, and industry come together to create biomedical innovation. And basically, I'm here today to talk about patient DAOs and their role in driving biomedical research and translation going forward. And the reason why I believe that patients are the driving force is because ultimately they are the ones that are the most incentivized to cure disease, but also are increasingly over time the source of the most granular data, which will help drive biomedical research going forward. And when these two forces have been harnessed in a way which is productive and doing that alongside scientists, it's led to some substantial results. For example, the story of the open artificial pancreas system with the diabetes movement in the 2010s. In essence, this was a response to the industry when they weren't providing products that the patients wanted to help with them managing their blood glucose levels. But in response to this, in essence, there was a distributed group of patients, scientists, and hackers who came together to create this new open artificial pancreas system, which led to the improvements in the ability to manage blood glucose levels within range, and also improve the quality of life for patients. And then if you fast forward into now, you actually find that the big medical companies like Medtronic have actually copied this innovation and now profiting from that. But make no mistake, this came from the patients in the first instance. Another example of a patient movement was the AIDS movement in the 1980s. Another example of when patients led a movement in collaboration with scientists to find a cure for the AIDS disease, but also to get funding for early stage research and basic research to make that happen. And this is all done in the face of complacency of the government at the time, but also the FDA. And ultimately, this did lead to the treatments that the community needed. It's also the basis, the research that they did was also the basis of a lot of things that we use today. And if you look at the FDA and how they function, they've made some substantial changes on the back of this. So for example, they include patients on certain boards, and also they have now more faster tracks to approve drugs and research products. And finally, we have the story of Henrietta Lacks, who inadvertently led a lot of biomedical progress. So in essence, she had cervical cancer in the 1950s, and she had a biopsy taken by one of the scientists at Johns Hopkins. She died, but ultimately the biopsy had a lot of unique properties, and this sparked the curiosity of scientists around the world at the time, and therefore the data was shared amongst them. And several decades later, we can find that there's been hundreds of thousands of research papers which are published based on this information. We also find that pharma made a lot of money with products that were developed on the back of the information. And yeah, there was a lot of progress made, and obviously there are some ethical issues with the story, which can be discussed in a minute. But the point is, like, the patient level and granular data led to a lot of this progress in a lot of fields in biomedicine. So what are commonalities in these three examples? Well, the commonality is that when patients, communities, and their data combined with motivated scientists come together, that results in substantial progress. But some of the examples that I mentioned, that they haven't been perfect. So as I mentioned with the Henrietta Lacks story, in essence, her data was used without her family's consent. And obviously big pharma and a lot of scientists benefited from this massively, but there's a lot of ethical concerns there. And then if you look at the AIDS movement as well, there was some infighting amongst the movement at the time, where you had the more scientific and policy-minded fraction of the movement versus the more activist wing of the movement, which led to some conflict, which started with the movement. But when you look at the Web3 infrastructure and the tools it provides, it can help us to mitigate some of those issues, but also enhance some of the strengths that we're seeing within these movements. So for example, the fact that we can have permissioned access to data, so you can aggregate your information and share it with whoever you please, and you can track that. And also the nature of DAOs and the fact that they're distributed, and you can have governance and reputation systems to help weed out some bad actors. And also the fact, because these DAO infrastructure systems are global systems now, so you'll be able to capture a lot more support from the global community, but also attract more funds to push the research and fund the research that the community needs. And early stage researchers have a huge incentive to reconsider how things have been done, because as I'm sure a lot of you know, academia do make a lot of contributions in the kind of early and stage of research, but a lot of this research we find doesn't really translate to a real world outcome for patients. But then if you look at according to Andrew Lowe, the top selling drugs, the top 30, you find that 26 of those actually found their origins within academia. So whilst a lot of their basic research outputs don't translate to a real world outcome, when you look at the real world outcome, they are disproportionately coming from the early stage researchers. So there's a lot of value which is being created in the early stage of the research pipeline, but which isn't reaching. And imagine if we were able to double this effort, the impact it would have on curing disease and our general lives. And again, patient DAOs will be very well placed to help pull these discoveries out of the early stage research part of the pipeline, been able to potentially gain capital for that research, but also using some of the patient experience and data to help make early findings more translatable to a real world outcome. Pharma also has an incentive to change how things are done. So since the 1960s, the drug development pipeline has been on an exponential cost increase in terms of the cost of development. And this has been in the face of technological advances, and the failure rate of research efforts is still at around 90%. So overall, there's a huge incentive for early stage researchers as well as biotechs to make changes in the process. But ultimately, it's the patient who has the biggest incentive, because they bear the brunt of the failures that we've seen. So in terms of where we go from here, I think a very useful quote to frame this is a quote from Thomas Kuhn's book, where he says, "In both political and scientific development, the sense of malfunction that can lead to crisis is prerequisite for revolution." And obviously, DeSci is a revolution in itself, and that's been in the face of the malfunction that we've seen, as demonstrated in the previous slides. But in order to get the paradigm that we actually need to help this overcome those issues, I believe that it needs to be guided by the patient perspective and patient DAOs, because they are the ones who are the most incentivized to cure disease. And I think they'll be very well placed to help guide in collaboration the intellectual capability of the community, but also the capital that it has been able to raise. So in summary, why patient DAO is going to be the driver? Well, they're uniquely placed to build community data economies and obtain funds. They incentivize people towards a common goal, for example, curing disease. And finally, in general, decentralized systems will be able to handle complexity far better than centralized systems, because the world is a very complex place and biology is also very complex. So having a distributed network of experts working real time will, in my opinion, far out compete the centralized systems working in isolation and silos. And here's one example of how a patient DAO could contribute to basic and preclinical research. So patients have a lot of information in terms of their experience. They can also express unmet needs, pose research questions, and also contribute data and analysis. And if you use this information, the scientists can then narrow their search in terms of literature reviews and also data analysis, and also pose some additional research questions based on the patient's data and feedback. And this will, if it works in the ideal case, would result in a research proposal and ideas which have been validated by a patient community. And this, by definition, makes that the likelihood of the research translating to the real world far more likely, because it's been validated by the real world experience of the end user. And if you look at the likes of some studies from, for example, Andrew Lowe, who talks about incorporating patient preferences via Bayesian decision analysis, so really trying to quantify the patient's willingness to accept risk and will it outweigh the benefit, for example. I think that can be used in a variety of ways to help quantify the patient's perspective and prioritize research and make it more translatable. And assuming that there are some very beneficial proposals and ideas which have been created as a result of that collaboration, patient DAOs are in a very good position to fund those proposals and ideas, and they can vote on that using a system like quadratic voting, for example, to make sure that the interests aren't too skewed in a particular direction. And the funding is one part, but we can also look at the delivery as well. So, for example, patient DAOs are, as I mentioned, like patients in general, but especially at a aggregated level, are increasingly becoming the source of useful information to drive translation and research. For example, their omics data, devices and apps, data, health records, patient biomaterials would come from them as well. And the scientists can use this information to help identify targets which are worthy of investigation, but also to validate compounds which will, based on that patient data, and again, to increase the likelihood of translating and having success in clinical trials. And also patient DAOs can play a huge role in the new world of decentralized clinical research trials, which have especially become more prevalent since the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, there's been a lot of information that can be collected at this point from the patients in terms of their data, their perspectives, etc. And scientists who are conducting the trials can use this information to design trials which are, more geared towards the patients and the desired outcomes. And with this information, we can also better recruit patients, because if you look at the information and data, we can make sure that the right patients are selected for particular trials. And DAOs, as I mentioned earlier, have incentive ways. If you have the token, you can incentivize people to take part in clinical trials. And we know that one of the issues in the real world at the moment with pharma, etc., is that they don't have a very good track record of keeping patients incentivized throughout the whole of the trial. And there's actually quite a high dropout rate in some instances, for example, in breast cancer. So yeah, I think the incentives will also help with success in this new field. But also, when it comes to conducting the clinical trials, we know that the use of real-world data is increasingly becoming more of a factor. If you look at the FDA, the EMA, and the MHRA in the UK, for example, they've all recently released guidance on using real-world data to help expedite and speed up clinical trials. And the source of a lot of this information comes from patients and their devices and whatnot. So these means can be used to help take part in clinical trials, and scientists can use that information to validate that data to hopefully have a valuable clinical research output. So in order to make this possible, we need to have composable DeSci communities and protocols to collaborate to make this a reality. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, there are a lot of DeSci protocols that focus on the early stage of discovery and the delivery of science, but also the funding of that science. But increasingly, we're finding that the patient element of this is becoming more prominent. So obviously, Fleming Protocol, my company, we're one of those patient DAOs. Bio, who recently announced their company, they're focused more on rare diseases. And increasingly over time, there'll be more of these patient DAOs to make this a more complete picture. And yeah, ultimately, we need to make sure this all works and functions together in the correct way so that we can disintermediate the current system, which isn't working for scientists or patients. And finally, I believe that the end goal should be to achieve almost like a patient network state, where you have millions of patients who are collaborating alongside millions of scientists on the world's toughest issues when it comes to curing disease and scientific breakthroughs. And when we get to that state, we can have more capital and a bit more clout to take control of the whole research development pipeline, and also have some regulator legitimacy. So bearing in mind the amount of capital which is flowing through the crypto space, the likelihood of that growing over the next few decades is quite high. And the likelihood with that would mean that we can be in a better position to fund the whole drug development pipeline. But there may still be quite a bit of time before we get there. We also need to, in this new system, harness distributed science tools and the idea of self-experimentation and doing so safely. So, for example, a somewhat controversial example would be the use of home CRISPR kits and allowing people to do experiments in their own homes. And granted that there are some potential risks there, but I think given if you have a system which has the right governance, and obviously over time these technologies will develop to be a bit more safer, and yeah, having the right governance to help with and guide that effort would, I think, have potential implications, like beneficial implications for personalized medicine and other fields. And it's also worth noting that there has been several examples of Nobel Prizes being awarded for discoveries which were actually discovered initially from doing self-experimentation. So I think if we're able to distribute that in a way that's effective with new tools, then I think we'll make a lot of substantial progress in scientific discovery. And all of this needs to be underpinned by new models of intellectual property and discovery. So we know that, for example, Molecule are looking at IP NFTs, which I think is a good model potentially, and also crowdfunding cures who are looking at new ways to incentivize research efforts to translate to a real world patient outcome. So we need to kind of keep up that momentum with finding these new models to make sure that they gear towards more patient outcomes and improving those. So I'm going to finish this presentation with a quote from one of our collaborators who's a part of the diabetes community. His name is Ben West, and he's one of the founders of the Night Scout application. He says, "Let us consider how we can unify our demands for trustworthy, high-fidelity therapy that, adapting to our lifestyles, allows us to return to the lives we want to pursue with the people and activities we love. Let us make the benefits we discover accessible to as many as possible." And I think this is a very good way to end this presentation, and also a very good reminder as to why DeSci and patient DAOs need to exist and collaborate. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andre. That was really wonderful. And yeah, maybe I can kick off like some of the question and answers. So I guess when it comes to patient data, one important thing, at least like in the current like universities and hospitals, is like HIPAA regulations. And so especially with researchers with patient data, you want to make sure to de-identify that patient's kind of name and information and things like that, and then kind of leverage the information that you might need. And then just kind of wondering on like the level of privacy, how some DeSci projects or Fleming is going to go about kind of maintaining that set of privacy, whether that's with something like zero knowledge proofs or like some other method.
Yeah, that's a very important point, because if you take the likes of GDPR, for example, where the producers of that data have the right to be forgotten. So a lot of the decentralized storage solutions wouldn't really account for that. But if you look at, for example, Ocean Protocol, and there's a new company called WeaveChain, they have a workaround on that, in the sense that they allow scientists to run computations on data which is stored locally on machines. So it's locally on the patient's device, for example, and the scientist can still get a meaningful output from that, and the patient still has the ability to be forgotten. So yeah, I think the computational computing, zero knowledge proofs will play a huge role in that, because obviously a lot of this health data is very sensitive, and we need to maintain that to make patients more willing to share information for the benefit of research. I think zero knowledge proofs and computational computing in general will play a big role in that, or a very essential role in that, actually.
Oh, okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you. I didn't know about that. Okay, so looking at the Q&A, I don't think there's any particular questions. One person commented saying there's a high risk of high bias data.
I guess it depends on the data you're talking about, because I guess if you want to talk about data that comes from Apple watches, for example, like heart rate and sleep, etc., if you were to account for that in research, obviously it's probably a fair assumption to say that people who are from affluent backgrounds are more likely to have an Apple Watch, and therefore the data that you're getting fed into this research will be skewed towards that, as opposed to people who are from more deprived backgrounds. But then if you look at diabetes, for example, where they have, a lot of the people have to monitor their blood glucose levels several times a day, and they have their own devices and apps like Tidepool, which can aggregate their information. And yeah, because that's almost essential for diabetes patients to do that, I think there'll be less of an issue, because if you have diabetes, you need to do it. And if you want to engage in this research, then you can. So the barrier of entry in that respect is not as high as opposed to with Apple Watches. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think that was pretty reflective of what the question was. And then we just got a last minute one from Giovanni. He said, "Thank you for your presentation and project. It's very ambitious and exciting," which I definitely agree. I wonder how would you deal with patient compliance and monitoring during a trial via patient DAOs?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And I'll be lying if I said that we had the solution for that straight, the perfect solution for that. But I know there are, in the traditional sense, they have these data committees which look at the integrity of data which is being pushed through the drug development pipeline, for example. So I can totally foresee that in the DAO governance, you can have a working group like that, which will be in charge of looking at data integrity and being incentivized to keep on top of that. There may be some other potential solutions around that. Like I know in the FDA guidance, for example, they talk about the risk of data integrity when doing things more remotely. So there will be some suggestions in there, but because decentralized trials are still a new phenomenon, there's definitely some work that needs to be done to make sure that the solutions are concrete. But I think having a dedicated group who is incentivized to look at data integrity and compliance, etc., I think is a good way to go in a Web3 context. But yeah, I'm sure there are some other solutions that can be considered, which I'm not aware of at this point in time.
Okay, awesome. And then we got a last one again by Patrick. So maybe we can do a quick one here, and then I want to respect the time of the next one, the next speakers. But said, "Hey Andre, how much success have you all had trying to explain your tokenomics to patient communities? Have you found a simple, succinct way to get patients on board with Fleming's reward structure? I'm asking because DeFi tokenomics can be incredibly complicated, and it feels like this might be a barrier to adoption to patients who may not have the time or background to fully understand this mechanism."
Yeah, again, a very good question. The way we've kind of been approaching it is not to be too heavy in the discussions of the tokenomics, and more starting from what the use cases could be and what it could mean for patient communities. And I think that's the best way to start. And then when there's the more kind of technically minded who want to dig in a bit more deeper into the detail. And if you take the diabetes community, there are plenty of those people because they're quite technical and they've been kind of hacking devices for decades. So you do have those members of the community as well, and you can have the more technical conversation with them. But I think on a more broader scale, it's really about trying to start with the use case and what the implications could mean for curing disease and everything else that's more relevant to patients. I think if you can explain that in a good way and then frame how crypto can help with that after that without getting too technical, I think that's probably the best way to go. But also be ready for some of the communities who would want to know that detail, because they do exist as well. So it's a bit of a mixed approach in terms of how we go about that. It depends on who you're speaking to. But I think in general, definitely starting with the use case and speaking in simple terms is the best way.